I maintained my composure as my husband Nathan's aunt placed a sympathetic hand on my arm. "Don't worry, dear," she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "The men in this family always joke too much when they introduce you as the temporary wife." The rest of his family chuckled, champagne glasses clinking as they exchanged knowing glances. Little did they know I owned not just our home, but the vacation property they were all gathered in for their annual winter retreat. And soon, Nathan would be on his knees begging me to sign it all over to him. 3 years of calculated patience was about to pay off. Tomorrow morning, Nathan would discover just how temporary our arrangement truly was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months after that humiliating holiday party, I sat at our marble kitchen island watching the spring rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows. The tasteful modern decor reflected my aesthetic perfectly. No surprise, since I'd designed every inch of this house long before Nathan entered my life. The distinctive sound of his Mercedes pulling into the garage broke the peaceful silence. Right on time. I took a slow sip of my tea and straightened the stack of documents beside me. Nathan strode in with the confident swagger he'd perfected in boardrooms across Boston. At 42, he still turned heads with his tall frame and perpetually tanned skin, courtesy of monthly sessions at an exclusive salon. His tailored suit couldn't quite hide the beginnings of a paunch, the result of too many business dinners and not enough of the morning runs he'd claimed to love when we first met. "Good day?" I asked, keeping my voice light. His smile didn't reach his eyes as he loosened his Italian silk tie. "The Peterson deal is finally coming together." He poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon from the crystal decanter I'd bought him last Christmas. "Another month and we'll be looking at a very substantial bonus." I nodded appreciatively, playing the role I'd perfected over 4 years of marriage, the supportive, albeit temporary wife. "Actually," he continued, setting down his drink and retrieving his leather briefcase, "that's something I wanted to discuss with you." "Oh?" I maintained my neutral expression as he pulled out a thick manila folder. "I need you to sign these papers," Nathan said, sliding the folder across our kitchen island. His confident smirk, the same one I'd seen countless times when he thought he was being cleverer than everyone else, never wavered. "What are they?" I asked, though I already knew. My attorney had called me yesterday after Nathan's lawyer contacted her office. "Just some refinancing documents for the house," he replied casually, sipping his expensive bourbon. "The market's perfect for leveraging our equity. I've got some investment opportunities lined up with the Peterson Group that will double our money in 6 months." I opened the folder, methodically scanning the paperwork he clearly assumed I wouldn't read carefully or understand. Not refinancing documents, a complete transfer of ownership. His name alone would appear on the deed if I signed. Classic Nathan, thinking I wouldn't notice the difference. "You need my signature to transfer the house to just your name?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, devoid of the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Nathan's expression shifted slightly, a micro-adjustment I might have missed if I hadn't spent years studying his tells. "It's a technicality for the investment structure. I need clean collateral without encumbrances. Once everything pays off, we'll put it back in both names." Another lie. The Peterson deal was real, I'd verified that much, but it didn't require personal property as collateral. What Nathan didn't know was that I had a college friend who worked in their legal department. I murmured, flipping through the pages with deliberate slowness. "That's interesting. These documents would remove me completely from the deed. Like I said, it's temporary." "A formality for the banks," he replied, impatience creeping into his voice. He took another sip of bourbon, his wedding ring clinking against the crystal. The same ring he'd taken off twice in the past year during overnight business trips that mysteriously didn't appear on his company's travel records. I closed the folder and slid it back to him. "I'll need to review these with my attorney." His practiced smile faltered. "Since when do you have an attorney?" "Since I bought this house 7 years ago," I replied evenly. 3 years before I met you. The crystal tumbler froze halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about? We bought this house together after we got married." I watched his face carefully, cataloging every micro-expression as his confident facade began to crack. The slight widening of his eyes, the tightening at the corners of his mouth, the way his knuckles whitened around the glass. "No, Nathan," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt. "You moved into my house after we got married. I never added your name to the deed." "That's ridiculous," he scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "I've been making the mortgage payments for years." "You've been making payments to me," I corrected him. "Technically, you've been paying rent. Check the bank records. The transfers go to my personal account, not a mortgage lender." "That's not possible," he insisted, though doubt was now plainly visible on his face. "I would have noticed." "Would? You?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "You've never balanced a checkbook in your life, Nathan. You just assumed I was handling the mortgage payments with the money you transferred." His face flushed red as he struggled to process this revelation. "Why would you lie about something like this?" "I never lied," I replied calmly. "You assumed, and I never corrected you. There's a difference." I walked toward my home office, calling over my shoulder. "You might want to pour another drink. This conversation is just getting started." As I opened my office door, I heard the distinct sound of crystal shattering against marble. Nathan's composure was already breaking, and I hadn't even shown him the rest of my documentation yet. The offshore accounts, the record of his affairs, the evidence of his systematic financial manipulation. His temporary wife had been playing a much longer game than he could have possibly imagined. Before I continue this story, I want to welcome all of you joining me today. If you're new to this channel, we share authentic stories of relationships, resilience, and reclaiming your power. Consider subscribing. It costs nothing but means everything as we build this supportive community together. Now, let's rewind the clock and explore how I ended up married to a man who would introduce me as his temporary wife while trying to claim my property as his own. Camera transitions to softer retrospective lighting. 7 years before meeting Nathan, I was already establishing myself as a successful architectural consultant in Boston. By 30, I had turned an inheritance from my grandmother into significant investments, including the purchase of my dream home, a sleek, modern property overlooking the harbor that I'd personally redesigned from foundation to roof. Real estate had always been my passion. Growing up watching my parents lose their home during the 2008 financial crisis taught me that ownership wasn't just about having a place to live. It was about security, independence, and building generational wealth. I'd promised myself I would never be financially vulnerable. "You're too cautious," my friends would tell me when I turned down dates with charming men who seemed more interested in my portfolio than my personality. "Not everyone is after your money." Perhaps they were right, but 5 years of watching acquaintances navigate messy divorces and property disputes had made me wary. When I met Nathan at a charity gala, I hadn't been looking for a relationship at all. He approached me during the silent auction, champagne flute in hand and confidence in his stride. "You're bidding on the Maldives vacation package," he observed, glancing at my auction paddle. "I've been there twice. The resort they're offering is nice, but there's a better one on the north side of the island." What followed was an engaging conversation about travel, architecture. He claimed to appreciate modern design and our shared love of sailing. Unlike the other men I'd met at these events, Nathan asked questions and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. He didn't immediately try to impress me with his financial achievements or connections. Our first 6 months together were blissful. Nathan was attentive, intellectually stimulating, and respected my independence. He never pushed to move in together or questioned my financial boundaries. When he proposed on a sailboat at sunset, I found myself saying yes despite my long-standing reservations about marriage. "We'll keep our finances separate," he assured me, seeming to understand my concerns without me having to explain them in detail. "I respect what you've built for yourself." Looking back, I should have recognized the subtle red flags. How he casually mentioned he couldn't afford a more expensive engagement ring yet. How he'd joke about my beautiful home being our future place. How he'd mention future children and imply I might want to step back from my career when that happened. The shift began shortly after our wedding. Nathan's lease coincidentally ended, and he suggested moving into my house temporarily until we found our perfect home together. Somehow, that search never gained momentum. His belongings arrived in waves, first just essential clothes, then his prized book collection, then furniture he claimed had sentimental value. Within 3 months, he had fully moved in without us ever officially deciding that would happen. Still, I didn't correct his assumption about home ownership. Something in my gut told me to maintain this one crucial boundary, even as I allowed others to blur. I kept paying the mortgage from my personal account, accepting his monthly contributions as what they actually were, rent. The first time I heard him refer to me as his temporary wife was during a business dinner with his colleagues, 18 months into our marriage. "Rebecca's just keeping the home fires burning until I find someone younger," he joked to his boss, wrapping his arm around my waist while the table erupted in laughter. I froze, champagne glass halfway to my lips, forcing a smile I didn't feel. Later that night, when I confronted him about the comment in our bedroom, he dismissed my concerns. "It was just a joke, Becca. Don't be so sensitive. Everyone knew I was kidding." He kissed me on the forehead like you might soothe a child. "You know you're the only woman for me." That moment should have been our last, but I made the mistake many women do. I stayed, hoping it was truly just a tasteless joke. But tasteless jokes have a way of revealing underlying truths. Over the next 2 years, Nathan's temporary wife comments became more frequent, especially around his family and colleagues. Each time, I'd confront him. Each time, he'd dismiss my concerns and swear it was just humor. Meanwhile, I noticed other troubling patterns emerging. Financial documents would be moved from my home office. Questions about his late nights at work would be deflected. My professional accomplishments would be downplayed at social gatherings, while his would be exaggerated. "Rebecca used to work in architecture," he'd tell people, as if my thriving consultation business had somehow vanished. "But she's taking some time to focus on our home life now." The final straw came during last Christmas's holiday gathering at the vacation property I'd purchased in Vermont 5 years before meeting Nathan. His entire family had assembled for their annual retreat, a tradition they'd established after discovering I owned a picturesque mountain home that could accommodate them all. As Nathan's Aunt Barbara pulled me aside during dinner preparations, I overheard him in the next room. "No, this place isn't technically ours yet," he was telling his brother, voice lowered but still audible through the thin walls. "But I'm working on getting everything transferred over. Rebecca won't be a factor much longer." That night, as his family laughed about his temporary wife jokes, I made a decision. The charade had gone on long enough. It was time to reclaim not just my property, but my dignity. The next morning, I placed a call to my attorney, Victoria Chen, who had helped me protect my assets before marriage with careful planning and documentation. "It's time," was all I needed to say. Victoria understood immediately. For the next 3 months, I gathered evidence, consulted financial advisors, and prepared for the confrontation that would end my marriage. All while Nathan continued his plans, unaware that his temporary wife was several steps ahead of him. After returning from my home office, I found Nathan pacing the kitchen, bourbon bottle in hand. The shattered crystal lay untouched on the floor, tiny fragments glittering under the recessed lighting like diamond dust. His arrogance had been replaced by something I'd rarely seen in him. Panic. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered as I re-entered the room. "There must be some mistake. I've been paying for this house for years." "You've been contributing," I corrected him, placing a thick folder on the counter. "There's a difference." I opened the folder and spread out the contents. Property deeds, bank statements, transfer records, all meticulously organized and annotated by Victoria. "Here's the original deed showing I purchased this house 7 years ago. Here's proof the mortgage is in my name alone. Here are the payment records showing all mortgage payments coming from my personal account." I laid each document out methodically. "And here are the records of your monthly transfers to me, consistently coded as housing contribution in your own banking app." Nathan grabbed the bank statements, his eyes darting frantically across the numbers. "This isn't possible. You've been manipulating these records." "The bank might disagree with that accusation," I replied calmly. "Feel free to call them to verify." His face flushed deeper as realization set in. "Why would you do this? Let me live in your house for 4 years, thinking it was ours. Why would you tell your family and friends I was your temporary wife?" I countered, finally allowing some anger to color my voice. "Why would you tell your brother I wouldn't be a factor much longer?" He froze. "You heard that? Walls in Vermont cabins aren't particularly soundproof." I pulled out another document. From the folder, a printed transcript of his conversation with his brother. "But don't worry, I also have the recording." Nathan sank onto a bar stool, clutching the edge of the counter for support. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him, watching his carefully constructed plans crumble before his eyes. "What do you want?" he finally asked, voice hoarse. "I want you to move out," I said simply. "Immediately," he laughed bitterly. "Just like that? 4 years of marriage, and you expect me to pack up and leave tonight because of some joke you overheard?" "No, not because of a joke." I removed a final set of documents from the folder. "Because of these." I spread out a series of credit card statements, hotel receipts, and phone records. Dates and times highlighted in yellow, names circled in red. 3 years of methodical documentation of his infidelities, financial deceptions, and manipulative behaviors. Melanie Parker, your co-worker. 6 overnight stays at the Liberty Hotel when you claim to be at conferences. Jessica Weber, your brother's divorce attorney. 12 lunch meetings and 3 weekend trips to New York. And my personal favorite, Christine Dunham, my former college roommate, who you didn't realize still sent me Christmas cards mentioning the strange coincidence of meeting my husband at a bar when he wasn't wearing his wedding ring. Nathan's face drained of color. "You've been spying on me?" "I've been protecting myself," I corrected him, which, given what I discovered, was apparently necessary. I hadn't hired private investigators or installed tracking software. I didn't need to. Nathan's arrogance made him careless. Hotel charges on shared credit card statements. Location tags in social media posts he thought I wouldn't see. Receipts left in suit pockets he assumed I wouldn't check when doing laundry. His betrayal had left a paper trail a mile wide. "You're making too much of this," he tried, switching tactics. His voice softened as he reached for my hand across the counter. "Every marriage has rough patches, Becca. We can work through this." I withdrew my hand before he could touch me. 3 years of affairs isn't a rough patch, Nathan. It's a pattern. What about everything we've built together? There was a desperate edge to his voice now. You can't just throw away 4 years of marriage over some misunderstandings. We haven't built anything together, I replied, my voice steady. You lived in my house. You vacationed in my properties. You enjoyed the lifestyle my work provided. What exactly did you bring to this marriage except betrayal and public humiliation? The question hung in the air between us. For once, Nathan had no smooth comeback, no easy deflection. I want you out tonight, I continued. Victoria has prepared separation papers. They're quite generous considering the circumstances. You'll keep your personal possessions, your car, and your separate bank accounts. I won't contest any of that. And if I refuse? A flash of his old defiance returned. Then we do this the hard way. I picked up my phone. I have a police officer waiting for my call to escort you out for trespassing. I have a locksmith ready to change the locks. And I have enough evidence of financial impropriety to make your employer very uncomfortable. Your choice. He stared at me with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. You've really thought of everything. I've had years to prepare while you were busy making temporary wife jokes, I replied evenly. The fight seemed to drain out of him all at once. His shoulders slumped as he surveyed the mountain of evidence before him. I'll need time to pack. You have 2 hours. Whatever you can't take now can be collected later, supervised, by appointment. As Nathan trudged upstairs to gather his essentials, I remained in the kitchen, heart pounding despite my calm exterior. For 4 years I'd endured his subtle put-downs, his dismissive jokes, his gradual attempts to undermine my confidence and independence. Yet in less than an hour, the power dynamic had completely reversed. From the second floor came the sounds of drawers opening and closing, closet doors sliding, suitcases being pulled from storage. I checked my watch. He'd used 30 minutes of his allotted time. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "All set on this end. How's it going?" I typed back. "Proceeding as expected. No significant resistance." Victoria had a security team on standby, just in case. Another precaution I'd quietly arranged during those 3 months of preparation. Nathan had never shown violent tendencies, but people backed into corners sometimes reveal new aspects of themselves. 53 minutes after heading upstairs, Nathan reappeared with 2 large suitcases and a duffel bag. His eyes were red, though, whether from anger or tears I couldn't tell. "I'll need to come back for the rest," he said stiffly. "Contact Victoria to arrange it." I slid her business card across the counter. He picked it up, staring at it for a long moment. "How long have you been planning this?" "Does it matter?" "I guess not." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and placed his house keys on the counter. A symbolic gesture. I'd be changing the locks within the hour anyway. As he wheeled his luggage toward the door, he paused for one final attempt. "You know this house is too big for just you. You'll get lonely. You'll change your mind." I was never lonely before you, Nathan, I replied simply. "I doubt I'll start now." His face hardened at the dismissal. "This isn't over. I have rights as your husband." "You certainly do," I agreed. "The right to hire an attorney, and the right to explain to a judge why you tried to fraudulently obtain your wife's property while calling her temporary. I look forward to those conversations." Without another word, he walked out the door. I watched. Through the window as he loaded his luggage into his Mercedes and drove away, his taillights disappearing around the corner of my tree-lined street. Only then did I allow myself to sink onto the couch, emotions finally breaking through, the calm facade I'd maintained throughout the confrontation. Relief, vindication, grief, anger, all washing over me at once. 4 years of pretending, of swallowing humiliation, of documenting betrayal, had culminated in this moment of reclaimed power. I wasn't naive enough to think it was truly over. Nathan's final words weren't empty threats. He would regroup, consult. Attorneys, search for leverage. His ego wouldn't allow him to accept defeat so easily. But for the first time in years, I was no longer playing defense. I had reclaimed my narrative, my property, and my dignity. Whatever came next, I would face it on my terms. Not as someone's temporary wife, but as the woman who had outmaneuvered the man who underestimated her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The locksmith arrived 20 minutes after Nathan left. I watched him change every lock in the house, including the garage and garden gates, feeling a strange mix of liberation and sadness. 4 years of marriage erased with a few turns of a screwdriver. "All set, Miss Harrington," the locksmith said, handing me a set of new keys. "Is there anything else you need?" The use of my maiden name, which I'd never legally changed despite Nathan's persistent suggestions, felt right. "No, thank you. That's everything." After he left, I walked through the house alone, truly alone, for the first time in years. Nathan's presence lingered in small ways: a jacket forgotten on the coat rack, monogrammed towels in the guest bathroom, a half-empty bottle of cologne in the master bathroom. Remnants I would systematically remove in the coming days. Victoria called that evening to check in. "How are you holding up?" Her voice carried the steady calm that had made her one of Boston's most formidable divorce attorneys. "I'm fine," replied, curled up on the living room sofa with a glass of red wine. He left without much resistance. "That's unlikely to last," she warned. "Men like Nathan don't accept defeat easily, especially at the hands of women they've underestimated." "I know." I took a sip of wine, watching raindrops trace patterns down the window. "What's our next move?" "I've filed the separation papers. Given the evidence we have, we're in a strong position for the divorce proceedings. The house and Vermont property are indisputably yours. The documentation is ironclad. But be prepared for him to contest other assets." "What could he possibly claim?" I asked. "Everything substantial was mine before marriage." "Don't underestimate the creativity of desperate men," Victoria replied. "He could claim he enhanced the value of your properties through renovations or maintenance. He could argue his career moves were made to support your lifestyle, costing him better opportunities. He could even claim emotional damage." I laughed bitterly at that last suggestion. Emotional damage from what? Me not correcting his assumption that he co-owned my property? Exactly that. Perceived deception, even when there was none. I've seen pettier claims succeed with sympathetic judges. After hanging up, I couldn't sleep. Victoria's warnings played on repeat in my mind. I knew Nathan, his charm, his persuasiveness, his ability to spin narratives that cast him as the reasonable one. How many times had I watched him convince clients to accept proposals that primarily benefited him? How often had he reframed his selfish decisions as sacrifices? Sure enough, his first countermove came at 8:17 the next morning. My phone buzzed with texts from 3 mutual friends, from Stephanie. "Nathan called me crying last night. Said you kicked him out without warning. Are you okay? What's going on?" From Michael. "Hey, just checking in. Nathan stayed on our couch last night. Seemed pretty shaken up. Call me when you can." From Diana. "Coffee ASAP? Nathan's telling everyone you had some kind of breakdown. Need the real story." The narrative building had begun. I'd expected this. Nathan's first defense was always to control the story. In his version, I would be the villain, cold, calculating, possibly unstable. He would be the bewildered victim, blindsided by his wife's sudden irrational behavior. I responded simply to each. "There's much more to the story. I'll explain when I can. Please don't make judgments until then." By noon, my email pinged with a message from an unfamiliar address. Reynolds and Blackwell, attorneys at law. Nathan had hired counsel, quicker than I expected. The email was brief and professional, requesting all communication regarding the separation go through their office and demanding an immediate accounting of all marital assets. I forwarded it to Victoria without comment. Within 10 minutes, she had replied, "Standard intimidation tactic. Reynolds is all bark, no bite. We've faced off before. Leave this to me." The real escalation came that evening. I was reviewing client proposals in my home office when the doorbell rang. Through the security camera, I saw Nathan standing on the porch, looking considerably less polished than usual. His normally perfect hair was disheveled, his face unshaven. He wore jeans and a wrinkled button-down, clothing I'd rarely seen him in during our marriage. I didn't open the door, instead activating the intercom. Nathan, any communication needs to go through our attorneys now. Becca, please. His voice sounded ragged through the speaker. Just 5 minutes. We need to talk like adults. We tried that for 4 years, I replied evenly. Now we talk through counsel. I'm still your husband. His voice rose, that familiar edge of entitlement creeping in. You can't just lock me out of my own home. It's not your home, Nathan. We established that yesterday. Please leave before I call the police. He pounded on the door once, hard enough to rattle the frame. This isn't over, Rebecca. You think you've got everything figured out, but you have no idea what's coming. I watched through the camera as he stormed back to his car. Not the Mercedes, but a rental. Interesting. Had he needed to leave his car with Michael as collateral for something? I made a mental note to have Victoria look into his financial situation more deeply. Nathan's threat lingered in the air long after his car disappeared. You have no idea what's coming. Typical Nathan, vague intimidation designed to unsettle. I refused to let it work. The next morning, I met Diana for coffee at a small cafe 3 blocks from my office. Of our mutual friends, she was the most level-headed and the least likely to be swayed by Nathan's charm. He's telling everyone you had some kind of psychotic break, Diana said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from me. Claims you've been secretly recording him, hoarding money, and building some conspiracy theory about him stealing your house. I sipped my latte calmly. And what do you think? Diana studied me carefully. I think Nathan's version sounds suspiciously tailored to discredit anything you might say. Classic Darvo. Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. I smiled, genuinely grateful for her perception. Would you like to know what really happened? For the next 20 minutes, I gave her a concise version of events. The temporary wife comments, Nathan's attempt to transfer my house into his name, the evidence of his affairs. I didn't share everything. Some details would remain between me, Victoria, and eventually a judge, but I provided enough for context. Diana listened without interruption, her expression darkening as I spoke. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I believe you. And for what it's worth, I never liked how he spoke about you when you weren't around. What do you mean? This was new information. She hesitated. The temporary wife thing wasn't just for family gatherings. He'd make similar jokes at guys' nights. Mike and Chris always looked uncomfortable, but no one called him out. I heard about it from Chris's wife. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I'd always sensed Nathan's dismissiveness ran deeper than the occasional public joke. There's something else you should know, Diana continued, lowering her voice. Nathan came to our place last night after you. Wouldn't let him in. He's been asking people for loans. Apparently, his accounts are frozen. This was definitely news. Frozen? By whom? He didn't say, but he was panicking about making his car payment and some investment deadline. I hadn't frozen any accounts that Nathan solely owned. I had no legal authority to do so. If his accounts were restricted, it was either by his own bank or something else was happening that I wasn't aware of. Within the hour, I was on the phone with Victoria, relaying this new information. Interesting, she mused. Let me make some inquiries. If he's having financial difficulties beyond your separation, that could be leverage. The tension escalated further that afternoon. As I was leaving my office building, I spotted Nathan's rental car parked across the street. He sat behind the wheel, watching the entrance. When he saw me notice him, he started the engine and drove away without approaching. A clear intimidation tactic, letting me know he was monitoring my movements. I took a photo of the car and license plate before it disappeared around the corner and sent it to Victoria with a brief message. Nathan surveilling my office. Documentation attached. Her response was immediate. Documented. This helps our case. Consider a restraining order if it continues. The next escalation came in the form of a formal legal letter 2 days later. Nathan's attorneys were now claiming he had made substantial improvements to both properties during the marriage, entitling him to compensation for increased value. They also demanded access to all my financial records from 3 years before, our marriage to the present, a fishing expedition if I'd ever seen one. Victoria's response was masterful. She countered with our own demands. Full disclosure of all accounts Nathan had opened in the Cayman Islands during their marriage. We had evidence of at least 2. Complete documentation of his expenses during business trips that coincided with his affairs and sworn statements regarding his conversations about transferring property ownership. The resulting silence from his legal team was telling. They hadn't expected us to have knowledge of the offshore accounts. A week into the separation, the pattern became clear. Nathan would alternate between aggressive legal maneuvers and attempts to manipulate me emotionally. One day it was a demand through his attorneys. The next, flowers delivered to my office with a handwritten note claiming he still believed in us. One evening, a threatening email suggesting he had evidence that would ruin my reputation. The following morning, a tearful voicemail begging for reconciliation. I documented everything, sharing each contact with Victoria, building our case methodically while ensuring my own security. I changed my routines, varied my commute, installed additional security cameras at my home and office, and kept friends informed of my whereabouts. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned Nathan had moved from Michael's couch to a small apartment, downtown. He'd been forced to sell his Mercedes and was suddenly claiming his investment portfolio had suffered unexpected market losses. He'd stopped paying membership dues at his exclusive golf club and had been seen arguing with his bank manager. The man who had confidently tried to manipulate his way into owning my home was unraveling. But cornered animals are at their most dangerous, and I knew the greatest test was yet to come. 3 weeks after our confrontation, Victoria called with news that changed everything. The Securities and Exchange Commission contacted me this morning. She said, her voice unusually animated. They're investigating Nathan for securities fraud and wire fraud connected to something called the Peterson Group Investment Fund. I nearly dropped my phone. The Peterson deal, the investment opportunity Nathan had claimed, required putting my house in his name as collateral. What kind of fraud? Apparently, he's been running a sophisticated variation of a Ponzi scheme with several colleagues. They created a shell investment company promising extraordinary returns to attract investors. The funds were mostly diverted to personal accounts in the Cayman Islands and elsewhere. The pieces suddenly aligned with perfect clarity. Nathan's urgent need to transfer my house into his name, his recently frozen accounts, his desperate search for cash. He wasn't just trying to steal my property, he was seeking assets that couldn't be easily seized when his scheme inevitably collapsed. How long has this been going on? I asked, mind racing. According to the SEC, at least 2 years. They've been building their case quietly. The timing of our separation was actually fortunate. It creates a clear delineation between you and his activities. Do I need to speak with them? Yes, they've requested an interview. I'll accompany you, of course. But Rebecca? Her voice took on a gentler tone. This changes everything in our favor. Nathan isn't just facing divorce. He's potentially facing federal charges. The SEC interview was scheduled for the following day. I spent the evening reviewing my records of Nathan's financial discussions during our marriage, searching for any mention of the Peterson Group. There were fragments, comments about a guaranteed investment opportunity, references to clients with exclusive access, mentions of returns that, in retrospect, were too good to be true. Had I been completely blind, or had Nathan been exceptionally careful around me? Perhaps a bit of both. His dismissive temporary wife framing had actually worked to his advantage. The less seriously he appeared to take me, the less likely I was to be viewed as a potential co-conspirator. The SEC offices were housed in a nondescript federal building, downtown. Victoria met me in the lobby, briefcase in hand, projecting her usual calm confidence. "Remember," she advised as we rode the elevator to the 14th floor, "answer only what's asked. Don't volunteer information or speculate. They're not investigating you, but anything you say could potentially be used in their case against Nathan." 2 agents conducted the interview in a sterile conference room. Agent Dawson, a stern-faced woman in her 50s with steel gray hair pulled into a tight bun, and Agent Mercer, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses who took meticulous notes. Throughout. "Mrs. Harrington," Agent Dawson began, "we understand you're currently separated from Nathan Ellis and were unaware of his activities with the Peterson Group Investment Fund. Is that correct?" I confirmed this was accurate, then spent the next 2 hours answering detailed questions about Nathan's finances, his business associates, his travel patterns, and any discussions we'd had about investments. "Did Mr. Ellis ever ask you to sign financial documents without fully explaining them?" Agent Mercer asked, about halfway through the interview. "Yes," I replied, recounting the incident that had triggered our separation. 3 weeks ago, he presented papers he claimed were for refinancing our home. They were actually documents to transfer the property solely into his name. The agents exchanged glances. "And this property was already yours before the marriage?" Agent Dawson clarified. "Yes, purchased 7 years ago, 3 years before I met Nathan. I maintained sole ownership throughout the marriage." They asked for copies of those documents, which Victoria provided from her briefcase. She had anticipated this request. "One final question, Mrs. Harrington," Agent Dawson said as the interview wound down. "Did Mr. Ellis ever mention any of these names in connection with his business dealings?" She slid a list across the table. I recognized several names. Clients Nathan had mentioned, golf partners he'd introduced me to at club events, even one of his former colleagues who'd attended our wedding. "Yes, these 4, I indicated. He described them as investors or business associates. "This one," I pointed to a name near the bottom of the list, "is his brother-in-law from his first marriage." The agents thanked me for my cooperation, explaining they might need to speak with me again as their investigation progressed. "What happens now?" I asked Victoria as we left the building. "They'll continue building their case. Given what they already know, there will likely be indictments soon. As for us, this gives us significant leverage in the divorce proceedings." She was right. The very next day, Nathan's attorney requested an urgent meeting to discuss settlement terms. The aggressive demands had vanished, replaced by a surprising willingness to negotiate. I learned why that evening, when my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the security camera, I saw Nathan again, but this time, he looked utterly defeated. Gone was the designer clothing, the confident posture, the manicured appearance. The man on my porch looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. Against my better judgment, I activated the intercom. "Nathan, I told you to communicate through our attorneys." "Please, Rebecca," his voice cracked. 5 minutes. I'm not here to threaten or argue. I just need to talk to you. Something in his broken tone made me hesitate. After confirming through the camera that he was alone, I opened the door but remained in the doorway, blocking entry. Up close, he looked even worse. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes rumpled as if he'd been sleeping in them. "Thank you," he said quietly. 5 minutes, I reminded him, arms crossed. "I know about the SEC investigation," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everything's falling apart. They've seized almost all my assets. Reynolds dropped me as a client when they learned about the federal investigation. I'm facing potential criminal charges." "That's unfortunate," I replied neutrally. "But it doesn't explain why you're here." "I need your help, Becca," he said, desperation evident in his voice. If you would consider dropping the divorce proceedings and signing a statement that you were aware of my investment activities, it could help my case. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. Even now, facing criminal charges, his instinct was to manipulate me into taking the fall with him. Let me understand, I said slowly. You want me to lie to federal investigators, potentially implicating myself in your fraud, to help your legal defense. It wouldn't necessarily be lying, he argued weakly. We discussed investments several times. You could just say you were generally aware. No, I cut him off firmly. Absolutely not. Becca, please, his voice cracked again. I'm begging you. They're talking about serious prison time. Everything I've worked for is gone. My reputation is destroyed. You're the only person who can help me now. The same way you helped me? I asked quietly. By calling me your temporary wife? By trying to steal my house? By cheating on me for years? He flinched at each accusation. I know I've made terrible mistakes. I've been a horrible husband. But we were together for 4 years. Doesn't that count for anything? For a moment, looking at this broken version of the man I'd married, I felt a flicker of pity. But it was quickly extinguished by the memory of all his calculated cruelty. It counted for something, Nathan. It taught me exactly who you are. I stepped back, preparing to close the door. Your 5 minutes are up. Wait, he said desperately, putting his hand on the doorframe. What if I sign everything over to you? The Vermont property, I know the deed is already in your name, but I'll waive any claims to improvements or contributions. My investment portfolio, what's left of it? After the SEC investigation. My retirement accounts, they're small, but they're something. Everything I have in exchange for your help. I almost laughed at the irony. You're offering to sign over assets that are either already mine or about to be seized by federal authorities? His expression confirmed my suspicion. He was drowning and grasping at anything that might look like a lifeline. There's nothing you can offer me, Nathan, I said firmly. Not property, not money, not explanations or apologies. The only thing I want from you is distance. You're really going to let me face this alone? His voice hardened, that familiar entitlement creeping back in despite his desperate situation. After everything we shared? Yes, I replied simply. Just like you left me alone every time you introduced me as your temporary wife. Just like you planned to leave me with nothing when you tried to transfer my house into your name. I never meant to hurt you, he tried, one last attempt at manipulation. Everything I did was for us, for our future. No, Nathan. Everything you did was for yourself, and now you get to face the consequences by yourself. I closed the door firmly, engaging the deadbolt with a satisfying click. Through the security camera, I watched him stand there for nearly a minute, shoulders slumped, before finally turning and walking away. This time, there was no dramatic exit, no squealing tires or slammed doors. Just a defeated man shuffling down the path toward whatever future his actions had created. I called Victoria immediately to report the interaction, which she documented as another attempted manipulation and potential witness tampering to share with the SEC. 2 days later, the news broke publicly. Boston executive charged in multi-million-dollar investment fraud, the headlines declared. Nathan's corporate headshot appeared on financial news websites alongside details of the scheme that had allegedly defrauded investors of over $12 million. My phone exploded with messages from friends and acquaintances, most expressing shock and asking if I'd known anything about Nathan's activities. I responded with a brief, carefully worded statement Victoria had helped me craft. I was unaware of my husband's fraudulent activities and am cooperating fully with authorities. I ask for privacy during this difficult time. One message stood out from the rest, a text from Diana. You dodged a nuclear missile, not just a bullet. Dinner tonight? You shouldn't be alone with all this happening. Her support meant more than she could know. Throughout the chaos of the past month, she had remained steadfastly in my corner, never questioning my version of events, never suggesting I work things out with Nathan as some other friends had. Yes, please, I replied. My house at 7? I'll order from that Italian place you love. As I set my phone down, I caught my reflection in the window. The first time I'd really looked at myself since everything began. I expected to see exhaustion, stress, perhaps lingering sadness. Instead, I saw something unexpected: calm strength. The woman looking back at me wasn't broken or defeated. She was resilient, determined, and finally free. Nathan's desperate visit had provided something I hadn't anticipated: closure. Seeing him stripped of his arrogance, reduced to begging for my help, had punctured any lingering emotional attachment I might have harbored. The man I'd married had been revealed as entirely hollow, a careful construction of charm and lies designed to take rather than give. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the home that had always been mine, I realized that Nathan's greatest gift to me had been unintentional. In trying to take everything from me, he had ultimately freed me from the prison of a loveless marriage built on deception. The temporary wife had outlasted him after all. The Italian marble countertop felt cool beneath my fingers as I signed the last document in the stack. Victoria watched from across the kitchen island, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. And with that, she said, collecting the papers and sliding them into her leather portfolio, it's officially, completely over. I exhaled slowly, feeling a weight lifting that I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, but the legal entanglements with Nathan's case had lingered until today. The victim's restitution fund is satisfied with your contribution of the Vermont property, Victoria continued. Your cooperation has been noted by the prosecutors, and they've confirmed you have no further obligations in the case. So I'm completely disentangled, I said, the words feeling strange on my tongue. Completely. Victoria accepted the glass of sparkling water I offered. Nathan's sentencing is next month, but that doesn't involve you. You're free to move forward without looking back. Nathan had pleaded guilty to securities fraud and wire fraud 4 months ago, after the evidence became overwhelming. The plea deal had spared him the maximum sentence, but he was still facing significant prison time. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and charmed potential investors was now wearing prison-issued clothing, awaiting a judge's decision on how many years he would spend behind bars. I had chosen not to attend any of the hearings after my initial deposition. Whatever happened to Nathan now was between him, his victims, and the justice system. My part in his story was finished. How are you feeling? Victoria asked, studying me over the rim of her glass. Lighter, I replied after considering the question. Like I've been carrying around a backpack full of rocks that I can finally set down. After Victoria left, I wandered through my home, truly mine now, in every sense. In the past year, I had systematically erased Nathan's presence. The guest bathroom had been completely remodeled. The master bedroom furniture had been replaced. Even the living room had been repainted in colors I'd always preferred, but Nathan had dismissed as too bold. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Still on for tonight? I have news? Absolutely, I replied. Can't wait to hear. Diana had been my rock throughout the past year. While some friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with the scandal surrounding Nathan's crimes or unwilling to choose sides in what they perceived as a simple divorce, Diana had remained steadfast. She'd helped me sort through Nathan's remaining possessions, attended court hearings when I couldn't face them alone, and provided the laughter and normality I desperately needed amid the chaos. Through her, I'd met new people and rebuilt a social circle untainted by Nathan's influence. Among them was Thomas, an architectural historian I'd been dating casually for the past 3 months. Unlike Nathan, Thomas was genuinely interested in my work, asked thoughtful questions, and never once made me feel less than an equal partner in our evolving relationship. The dinner party tonight would be the first time I was hosting friends in my home since everything had settled. 6 people, including Diana and her new boyfriend, Thomas, and 2 colleagues from my expanding consulting business. A small gathering, but significant in ways they couldn't possibly understand. As I prepared for the evening, arranging flowers and chilling wine, my thoughts drifted to how profoundly my life had changed in a single year. My architectural consulting business had not just survived the potential scandal of being associated with Nathan's crimes, it had thrived. Several of Nathan's former investors, impressed by my integrity throughout the legal proceedings, had hired me for projects. My reputation for ethical business practices and straightforward communication had become my greatest professional asset. Financially, I had emerged largely unscathed. The house had always been mine, and my careful premarital planning had kept most assets separate. I had voluntarily contributed the Vermont property to the Victims' Restitution Fund, partly out of genuine sympathy for those Nathan had defrauded, and partly because I couldn't bear to keep a place that held so many memories of his subtle cruelty. The emotional impact had been more complex. For the first few months after Nathan's arrest, I had swung between relief, anger, grief, and guilt. Relief that I was free from his manipulation, anger at the years of diminishment I had endured, grief for the marriage I had thought was real, and guilt, irrational but persistent, that I hadn't recognized the extent of his deception sooner. Therapy had helped, as had long conversations with Diana and other supportive friends. Gradually, the emotional storm had calmed, leaving behind a clearer understanding of both Nathan's pathology and my own vulnerabilities. I had been drawn to Nathan's confidence and charm, mistaking his self-absorption for self-assurance. I had tolerated his dismissive, temporary wife comments, believing that standing by him despite the humiliation somehow proved my commitment. I had noticed the red flags, but had rationalized them away, unwilling to admit I had made a mistake in marrying him. These realizations weren't comfortable, but they were necessary for healing. I couldn't change the past, but I could learn from it. I could recognize similar patterns if they appeared in future relationships. I could strengthen my boundaries and trust my instincts. The doorbell rang at precisely 7 o'clock. Diana was always punctual, another quality I had come to appreciate even more after Nathan's habitual lateness, always with the excuse that important people run late. "You look amazing," she exclaimed, embracing me warmly before passing me a bottle of my favorite wine. Behind her, her new boyfriend Michael offered a shy smile and a bouquet of fresh flowers. "The place looks different," Diana noted, glancing around the living room as she shrugged off her coat. "I love what you've done with it." "It's finally exactly how I want it," I replied, realizing as I spoke that the statement applied to far more than just my home decor. By 7:30, all my guests had arrived. We gathered in the living room with drinks, the conversation flowing easily among people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. As I watched Thomas animatedly discussing the historical significance of Boston's architectural evolution with one of my colleagues, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine in my glass. "A toast," Diana announced suddenly, raising her glass. "To Rebecca, who turned a nightmare into an opportunity and showed all of us what real strength looks like." As glasses clinked and warm smiles were directed my way, I felt a surge of gratitude for these people who saw me, truly saw me, not as someone's temporary wife, but as a woman of substance and worth. Later, after dinner had been served and dessert was being enjoyed, Thomas pulled me aside in the kitchen. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not what you might think," he added quickly, noticing my momentary alarm. "We're nowhere near that stage yet." He handed me a small, flat package wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a vintage brass key on a delicate chain. "It's from a 19th century Boston brownstone that was being renovated," he explained. "The architect saved it for me, knowing I collect historical architectural elements. It reminded me of you. Beautiful, strong, built to last, and absolutely essential." The thoughtfulness of the gift brought unexpected tears to my eyes. After years of expensive but impersonal presents from Nathan, jewelry selected by his assistant, designer clothes chosen more for how they would look on his arm than for my taste, this simple token from someone who actually paid attention to who I was felt revolutionary. "Thank you," I said simply, slipping the chain over my head. The key rested perfectly at my collarbone, its weight both substantial and comfortable. Thomas squeezed my hand gently. "Just a reminder that you hold the keys to your own life. Always, always will." The evening continued with laughter and conversation late into the night. As I bid farewell to the last guests around midnight, Diana lingered behind. "You seem happy," she observed, helping me gather wine glasses. "Genuinely happy." "I am," I confirmed, somewhat surprised by the realization. Not just relieved or recovering, but actually happy. "You deserve it," she said firmly. "After everything Nathan put you through." "That's just it," I interrupted, gently. "I don't think about it that way anymore. Nathan doesn't define my story. He was a chapter, a difficult one, but not the whole book." Diana smiled, squeezing my shoulder affectionately. That might be the healthiest thing I've ever heard anyone say about a toxic ex. After she left, I stood in my quiet kitchen, fingering the vintage key around my neck. Thomas was right. I had always held the keys to my own life, even when Nathan had tried to convince me otherwise. My decision to maintain separate property, to keep my maiden name, to continue my career despite his subtle discouragement. These had been expressions of an independence I had never fully surrendered, even at my most confused. The woman who had smiled politely through being introduced as a temporary wife hadn't disappeared. She had evolved. She had learned to distinguish between compromise and capitulation, between partnership and subjugation, between love and manipulation. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway. Mirror. The woman looking back at me was neither temporary nor defined by her relationship to any man. She was permanent, substantial, and entirely her own. And that, I realized, was the most valuable asset I'd protected all along. Not the house, not the property, not the financial independence, but the unshakable knowledge of my own worth that Nathan had tried and failed to diminish. Some things, once claimed, can never truly be taken away. When I started sharing my story, I wasn't sure how many of you would relate to it. The specifics of my situation with Nathan might seem extreme. The securities fraud, the attempted property theft, the very public downfall. But the messages I've received over the past few months have confirmed what I suspected all along. The underlying dynamics of diminishment, gaslighting, and emotional manipulation are far too common in relationships. Many of you have written to me about your own experiences with partners who slowly eroded your sense of self-worth, who introduced you with qualifiers that subtly undermined your status, who made jokes at your expense that weren't really jokes at all, who made you feel like you needed to be grateful for their presence in your life, even as they took far more than they gave. Today, I want to share some of the lessons I've learned, not just from my experience with Nathan, but from the healing journey that followed. These aren't universal truths, and I'm certainly not a relationship expert. But these insights have helped me rebuild my life in ways I never imagined possible when I was still standing in the shadow of a man who called me his temporary wife. First, trust your instincts. When I met Nathan, I had strong financial boundaries in place. I maintained separate property, kept my maiden name, and managed my own business. Something in me, call it intuition, self-preservation, or simply good sense, knew to keep these aspects of my life protected. And thank goodness I did. Those boundaries became my lifeline when everything else fell apart. But while I protected my external assets, I failed to protect something equally valuable: my emotional well-being. I ignored the discomfort I felt when Nathan made those temporary wife comments. I dismissed the red flags when he downplayed my professional accomplishments or made decisions without consulting me. I told myself I was being oversensitive instead of recognizing these as genuine violations of respect. Your instincts are trying to protect you. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Don't rationalize away your discomfort. Second, understand that love should never require humiliation. For years, I smiled through Nathan's public dismissals of me, believing that my willingness to endure this treatment somehow proved my commitment to our marriage. I confused tolerance of disrespect with unconditional love, real love uplifts. It sees you clearly and celebrates who you are. It doesn't require you to make yourself smaller or to accept being diminished for someone else's comfort or amusement. If your relationship regularly leaves you feeling less worthy, less capable, or less respected, that's not a reflection of your inadequacy. It's a symptom of an unhealthy dynamic. Third, recognize that financial independence is a form of self-care. I've received criticism from some viewers who suggest I was paranoid or unromantic for maintaining separate property throughout my marriage. They argue that true love requires complete merging of assets and identities. I respectfully disagree. Financial autonomy isn't about lack of trust or commitment. It's about ensuring your security regardless of how a relationship evolves. The sad reality is that approximately 40% of marriages end in divorce. Women, in Yain particular, often experience significant financial setbacks following marital dissolution. My architectural consulting career and property ownership weren't just professional accomplishments. They were insurance policies for my future self. This doesn't mean you can't build shared assets with a partner, but maintaining some level of financial independence, whether through separate accounts, continued career development, or property ownership, provides security that benefits everyone in the relationship. Fourth, surround yourself with people who see your value clearly. Diana's unwavering support throughout my separation and divorce was invaluable. She never questioned my version of events, never suggested I was overreacting, never encouraged me to work things out with Nathan for the sake of peace. In contrast, some friends I'd known for years defaulted to, "There are two sides to every story," or suggested that Nathan's behavior wasn't that bad. Some even implied that I should feel grateful that such a successful, charming man had chosen me in the first place. These reactions taught me something crucial. Not everyone in your life deserves equal influence over your decisions. Prioritize the voices of those who consistently affirm your worth and respect your boundaries. Fifth, there is immense power in documentation. Throughout my marriage to Nathan, I kept records: financial transactions, property deeds, emails, text messages, even notes about concerning conversations. I didn't do this with divorce in mind, but rather as a natural extension of my organized approach to life. When the time came to separate, this documentation proved invaluable. It protected me from Nathan's attempts to rewrite our financial history. It provided clear evidence of his manipulation and deception. It gave me leverage when his attorneys tried to claim assets that were legally mine. In any significant relationship, maintain important records. Keep copies of major financial documents. Save emails or texts that contain promises or agreements. Note dates and details of troubling incidents. This isn't about building a case against someone you love. It's about maintaining clarity in a world where memories can be selective and gaslighting is all too common. Sixth, and perhaps most importantly, remember that your value never depended on that relationship. When Nathan walked out of my life for the final time, I initially feared what would come next. Who would I be without the identity of Nathan's wife? however temporary he considered that role. How would I navigate social circles we had shared? Would my business suffer from association with his crimes? What I discovered instead was a profound homecoming to myself. Without Nathan's constant undermining, my confidence flourished. Without accommodating his preferences and managing his moods, I had more energy for my own pursuits. Without his dismissive presence, my social relationships deepened and became more authentic. The truth I want to share with all of you is this: a relationship that diminishes you is not a relationship worth saving. The fear of being alone often keeps us tied to people who don't truly see or value us. But that fear is based on a falsehood, that we are somehow incomplete or insufficient on our own. You are already whole. A partner should complement your life, not complete it. And certainly not complicate it with disrespect, manipulation, or cruelty. I've received thousands of messages since sharing my story, but one in particular has stayed with me. It came from a woman in her 60s who wrote, "I spent 37 years with a man who called me his practice wife. I stayed because I thought I had nowhere else to go and no one else who would want me. Watching your journey has made me realize I've had the keys to my own liberation all along. Today I met with a divorce attorney." If my story has helped even one person recognize their own worth and find the courage to demand better treatment, whether by setting stronger boundaries or by leaving a situation that diminishes them, then every uncomfortable moment of sharing these personal details has been worthwhile. Your life is not temporary. Your value is not contingent. Your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. You hold the keys to your own happiness. Always have. Always will. Before I close today, I want to thank all of you who have been following this journey. Your comments, messages, and support have meant more than you know. This community we're building together, focused on authentic relationships, personal growth, and mutual respect, has become one of the most meaningful aspects of my post-Nathan life. If you're new here, I invite you to subscribe. We cover everything from relationship dynamics to financial independence to creating a home that truly reflects who you are. And if you know someone who might benefit from these conversations, please share this video with them. Sometimes the right message at the right moment can change everything. Next week, I'll be talking with a financial advisor about creating unbreakable money boundaries in relationships without creating emotional distance. It's a balance many of us struggle with, and I'm excited to explore it together. Until then, remember, you may have been someone's temporary something once, but you are your own permanent masterpiece. Hello, everyone. It's been exactly 2 years since I posted the video that changed everything. My story about being Nathan's temporary wife and the journey that followed our separation. I wanted to create this special update because so many of you have reached out asking how things have evolved since then. Life has taken some unexpected turns, as it tends to do when you open yourself to new possibilities. So much has happened that I hardly know where to begin, but I promised you authenticity from the start, so here it is. The unfiltered update on life after Nathan. Let's start with the question I receive most frequently. Have you heard from Nathan since his sentencing? The answer is yes, but not in the way you might expect. 8 months ago, I received a letter from him, written from the federal correctional facility where he's serving his 6-year sentence for securities fraud. I debated whether to open it. Victoria, ever the cautious attorney, advised against it. Diana thought I should read it but not respond. Thomas simply handed me a glass of wine and said, "Whatever you decide, I'm here." After carrying it around unopened for 3 days, I finally read it while sitting alone on my back terrace. The letter wasn't what I expected. No desperate pleas for help or attempts to manipulate me into supporting his appeal. Instead, it was something I never thought I'd receive from Nathan, an actual apology. He wrote about having time to reflect on his behavior Not just the financial crimes that landed him in prison, but the emotional cruelty he had inflicted throughout our marriage. He acknowledged the temporary wife comments, the affairs, the attempt to take my house, all of it, without excuses or deflection. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote near the end, "nor am I asking for it. I simply wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused. You deserved better than what I gave you. I hope you found it." I never responded to the letter, not out of anger or resentment, but because there was nothing left to say. His acknowledgement didn't change the past, but it did provide an unexpected sense of validation. Sometimes that's as close to closure as we get. As for my professional life, the architectural consulting business has evolved in ways I never anticipated. What began as a one-woman operation is now Harrington Design Group, with a team of 7 talented architects and designers who share my vision for creating spaces that reflect the true essence of their owners. We specialize in helping people reclaim and redesign their homes after major life transitions: divorce, bereavement, empty nesting, retirement. These moments often leave people living in spaces that no longer serve who they are or who they're becoming. Our motto is, "Your space, your story," because I believe deeply that our environments should reflect our authentic selves, not the compromised versions we sometimes become in challenging relationships. The irony isn't lost on me that my experience with Nathan, a man who tried to claim my home as his own, has led to a career helping others reclaim their spaces. Sometimes our greatest wounds point us toward our most meaningful work. Many of you have asked about Thomas. That relationship evolved gradually and thoughtfully. After dating for about 8 months, we had a frank conversation about our future. We both wanted partnership, but were cautious about traditional marriage. Me, because of my experience with Nathan, him because of a previous relationship that had ended painfully. So we created our own definition of commitment. We maintain separate residences, his historic brownstone in Beacon Hill and my Harborview home, but spend most nights together. We've integrated our lives while maintaining our individual spaces, a balance that works beautifully for us both. The vintage key he gave me that night has become something of a talisman. I wear it almost daily, not as a reminder of Nathan or that chapter of my life, but as a symbol of the freedom that comes with being wholly yourself in a relationship. Diana remains my closest friend and has become the creative director at Harrington Design Group. Her eye for color and texture perfectly complements my architectural focus, and our friendship has only deepened through our professional collaboration. Her boyfriend Michael is now her fiancé, and yes, I'll be standing beside her at their wedding next spring. Financially, I've continued to practice what I preach about: independence and security. The business is thriving, investments are growing, and I've established a foundation that provides housing assistance and financial literacy education for women leaving abusive relationships. When I donated the Vermont property to Nathan's Victim Restitution Fund, I had no idea it would spark what has become my most passionate cause. Through that process, I connected with several of the people Nathan had defrauded, many of whom lost significant portions of their retirement savings or children's college funds through his schemes. Their stories touched me deeply, particularly one elderly couple who had invested their entire retirement with the Peterson Group on Nathan's recommendation. They weren't wealthy people. He had been a high school teacher, she a nurse, and their loss was devastating. My foundation's first project was securing stable housing for this couple, who had been forced to sell their home to cover basic expenses. After losing their investment, watching them receive the keys to their new condo, modest but mortgage-free, was one of the most rewarding moments of my life. This work has given purpose to what could have remained simply a painful chapter in my personal history. It's allowed me to transform the experience into something that genuinely helps others, not just through inspirational videos or cautionary tales, but through tangible support that changes lives. This is one of our recently completed projects, A fresh start for a woman who spent 15 years married to someone who criticized her taste, dismissed her opinions, and gradually convinced her she was incapable of making good decisions about anything, including home decor. When she first came, to us, she could barely choose a paint color without second-guessing herself. By the end of our collaboration, she was confidently selecting furniture, artwork, and finishes that reflected her previously suppressed aesthetic. Bold colors, mixed patterns, eclectic art pieces that her ex-husband had deemed tacky, but that brought her genuine joy. This transformation, from uncertainty to confidence, from suppression to expression, is what drives our work. It's also what has driven my personal growth over these past 2 years. 5 years have passed since I first shared my story about being Nathan's temporary wife. 5 years of growth, change, and unexpected developments that I never could have imagined when I sat in my kitchen that rainy evening, refusing to sign away my home to a man who had spent years subtly undermining my worth. This isn't a typical update video. Instead, it's a celebration of ripples, how one decision, one moment of standing firm in your truth, can create waves that extend far beyond your own life. When I started this channel, I thought I was simply sharing my personal experience as a cautionary tale about maintaining financial independence and recognizing emotional manipulation. I never expected it would evolve into a movement that has now helped thousands of women reclaim not just their physical spaces, but their sense of self. Today, I want to introduce you to some of those women and share how the conversation we started 5 years ago has expanded in ways that continue to astonish and humble me. Meet the board of directors for the Permanent Foundation, the nonprofit organization that grew from that first tentative step of donating the Vermont property to Nathan's Victim Restitution Fund. What began as a one-time gesture has become a nationwide initiative providing housing assistance, financial education, and design services to women rebuilding their lives after relationships that diminished them. Maria, our executive director, left a 20-year corporate career to lead this organization after watching my videos during her own divorce. Elaine, our head of financial education, was one of Nathan's victims who lost her retirement savings and has since become an advocate for financial literacy. Jennifer, who oversees our housing program, is a real estate developer who reached out after recognizing her own marriage in my descriptions of life with Nathan. Together with a dedicated staff of 15 and hundreds of volunteers nationwide, they've helped secure stable housing for over 400 women and their children in the past 3 years alone. Cut to Rebecca walking through a neighborhood of modest but well-maintained homes. This is Keystone Village, our most ambitious project to date. 32 affordable homes designed specifically for women transitioning from relationships where they experienced financial control and emotional manipulation. Each home comes with 2 years of property tax coverage, maintenance support, and financial counseling, giving residents time to stabilize their careers and rebuild their credit scores. But Keystone Village offers more than just housing. It provides community, a crucial element often lost when women leave controlling relationships. The community center offers classes ranging from basic home repair to investment strategies. The shared gardens provide both fresh produce and the therapeutic benefits of nurturing growing things. The co-working space allows residents to develop home-based businesses without the isolation that often accompanies working alone. Cut to Rebecca sitting with an older woman on a front porch. This is Margaret, one of our first residents. At 67, she left a 43-year marriage after watching our channel and recognizing the patterns of control and diminishment that had shaped her adult life. I always thought this was just how marriage was, she tells me, gently rocking in her chair. My husband handled the money, made the decisions, and occasionally reminded me I was lucky he kept me around. I decorated our home according to his preferences, wore clothes he approved of, and maintained friendships only with people he liked. Margaret's husband never physically abused her, never had affairs that she knew of, never did anything that would typically make headlines or warrant intervention. He simply, steadily, over decades, eroded her sense of self until she couldn't remember who she had been before becoming his wife. "Your video about the vintage key changed everything for me," she says, showing me her own key, now fashioned, into a garden ornament that hangs by her front door. "The part where you said you hold the keys to your own life kept repeating in my mind for weeks. One morning I woke up and thought, I'm 70% through my life, and I've never chosen a paint color without asking permission. That was the day I called a lawyer. Now Margaret teaches knitting classes at the community center, has painted her living room a vibrant teal, a color my ex-husband would have called gaudy, and recently started dating a retired professor she met at a local book club. I might have another 20 years if I'm lucky," she tells me, her eyes bright with purpose. "I intend to live them as myself." The most unexpected development in these 5 years has been the men who've reached out, not with defensive arguments or angry rebuttals, but with thoughtful reflection and genuine remorse. "Your videos helped me recognize behaviors I never questioned," wrote one viewer, a man in his 30s. "I realized I've been introducing my wife of 8 years as my current wife as a joke. I thought it was funny. After watching your channel, I asked her how it made her feel. The look on her face told me everything. I'm in therapy now, working to understand why I felt the need to undermine the woman I claim to love." Another wrote, "I was raised in a household where my father constantly belittled my mother. I absorbed the message that this was how men relate to their wives. Your story made me examine my own marriage and recognize I was repeating the pattern. My wife and I are now in counseling together, and I'm learning what genuine partnership looks like. These messages reflect something crucial about the work we're doing. It isn't about demonizing men or marriage as institutions. It's about recognizing and disrupting patterns of behavior that prevent authentic connection and mutual respect. Diana has been part of this journey from the beginning, first as the friend who stood by me through the separation, then as the creative director at Harrington Design Group, and now as a board member of the Permanent Foundation while running her own successful interior design firm. I always knew you were strong, she tells me over lunch. But I never imagined how many lives would be transformed because you refused to sign those papers that day. And her observation makes me reflect on the nature of courage. We often think of brave acts as grand gestures, running into burning buildings, standing before crowds, taking enormous risks. But sometimes the most courageous moment is simply saying no to someone who expects you to say yes. Sometimes bravery is as quiet as sliding unsigned papers back across a kitchen island. Thomas and I have settled into a partnership that continues to evolve in ways that surprise and delight us. 3 years ago, we designed and built a unique duplex, connected homes with shared common spaces but individual private retreats. It's become something of a model for couples who want both togetherness and autonomy, featured in several architectural magazines, and even inspiring a small movement of connected independence in residential design. The false dichotomy between complete merger and total separation is what traps so many couples, Thomas explains as we tend to our shared vegetable garden. We're taught that love means surrendering boundaries, that commitment requires sacrificing individuality. What if the healthiest relationships are those that make room for both connection and separateness? This philosophy extends beyond our living arrangement. We maintain separate bank accounts alongside joint ones, pursue individual interests while sharing core values, and actively support each other's independence while nurturing our connection. Thomas never saw me as temporary, never needed to diminish me to feel secure in himself. That foundation has allowed us both to grow, sometimes together, sometimes in parallel, without the fear that authentic self-expression might threaten our relationship. Occasionally, I receive updates about Nathan, usually through Victoria, who has remained my attorney and friend through these years. After serving 4 years of his 6-year sentence, he was released early for good behavior and now lives quietly in Arizona, working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company. According to Victoria, he's maintained sobriety, attends regular therapy, and has made consistent payments toward the Victim Restitution Fund, even beyond what was legally required of him. He has not attempted to contact me since that single letter from prison, respecting the boundary I established with my silence. I share this not to suggest a neat redemption narrative. Real life is messier than that. But to acknowledge that people can change when forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Whether his transformation is genuine or merely pragmatic doesn't particularly matter to me anymore. What matters is that the cycle of harm has been interrupted. Harrington. Design Group has grown into something I never envisioned when I was a solo consultant worried about being associated with Nathan's scandal. We now have offices in 3 cities, a staff of 32, and a client roster that includes everything from individuals reclaiming their spaces after difficult transitions to corporate clients seeking to create more humane work environments. Our design philosophy, that spaces should reflect and support authentic self-expression rather than imposing status or conformity, has resonated far beyond our initial target clientele. We've designed women's shelters that feel like actual homes rather than institutional facilities. We've reimagined corporate offices to support both collaboration and individual focus. We've created community centers that genuinely foster connection through thoughtful spatial arrangements. All of this grew from that moment in my kitchen when I refused to sign away my home, when I recognized that the physical spaces we inhabit are extensions of our identities and should be protected accordingly. For me personally, the woman once introduced as a temporary wife has found permanent purpose. The channel that began as a way to process my own experience has become a platform for broader conversation about relationships, boundaries, authenticity, and the environments that shape our daily lives. I recently published my first book, Your Space, Your Story, Designing a Life of Authenticity, which explores the connection between our physical environments and our emotional well-being. The response has been overwhelming, with readers sharing how they've applied these principles to reclaim not just their homes but their sense of agency. The most meaningful moments continue to be the quiet ones, the messages from women who've found the courage to leave situations that diminished them or to establish boundaries that protect their essence. The notes from men who've recognized harmful patterns in their own behavior and committed to change. The photos of newly painted walls in colors that would have once been forbidden, of gardens planted according to personal preference rather than someone else's approval, of spaces reclaimed and redesigned to reflect the true self. These are the ripples that matter most, the small, private revolutions that occur when someone realizes they are not temporary, not contingent, not defined by another's limited perception of their worth. 5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined standing here, looking back on how one decision, refusing to sign away my home, would transform not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others. I couldn't have foreseen how sharing my story would create this community of mutual support and inspiration. I've learned that our most painful experiences, when processed and shared with intention, can become bridges to deeper connection with others walking similar paths. That our wounds, when acknowledged and tended, can become sources of wisdom and compassion. That our moments of greatest vulnerability, when met with courage, can become our greatest strength. If you're watching this and recognizing your own relationship in my story, if you're smiling through jokes that diminish you, managing someone else's emotions at the expense of your own, questioning your perceptions because they conflict with someone else's narrative, please know this. You are not crazy. You are not too sensitive. You are not overreacting, and most importantly, you are not temporary. Your worth is inherent. Your perceptions are valid. Your needs matter. Your future is yours to determine. And whenever you're ready to reclaim your space, physical, emotional, financial, spiritual, there's a community here waiting to support you through every step of that journey. Because the most beautiful homes, like the most beautiful lives, are those built on foundations of authentic self-expression, mutual respect, and unwavering recognition of each person's permanent, irreplaceable worth. Until next time, remember, design your space, design your boundaries, design your life. You hold the keys, you always have, or because you've invested too much time to start over? Are you staying because this relationship allows you to be your authentic self? Or because you've forgotten who that person is? These aren't easy questions, but they're essential ones if we want to build lives of genuine fulfillment, rather than quiet desperation. 2 years after walking away from a man who saw me as temporary, I've built something beautifully permanent. Not just a successful business or a comfortable home, but a life aligned with my deepest values and truest self. And that, I believe, is the ultimate victory. This will be my final update specifically about the Nathan chapter of my life. Not because I'm hiding anything or because the story has a neat, tidy ending, life rarely provides those, but because I'm ready to be defined by what I'm moving toward rather than what I've left behind. Our channel will continue, of course. We have so much more to explore together about creating homes and lives that reflect our authentic selves. But from now on, Nathan will be a footnote, not a headline. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your support, your stories, your courage in sharing your own experiences. All of it has created a community I never expected, but now treasure deeply. If there's one message I hope you take from this final update, it's this. There is life. Rich, joyful, authentic life, after leaving someone who couldn't see your worth. It may not unfold exactly as you imagine. It may take unexpected turns. It may require rebuilding parts of yourself you didn't even realize had been dismantled. But I promise you this. On the other side of that difficult decision, of that painful transition, of that frightening leap into the unknown, there is freedom. There is peace. There is the exquisite joy of waking up each morning as yourself, whole and undiminished. You are not temporary. You never were. From temporary wife to founder of a movement, this journey wasn't one I chose, but it's become my life's most meaningful work. What began as one woman's refusal to sign away her home has touched thousands of lives, creating spaces where authenticity can flourish. Our strongest foundations are built not on grand gestures, but on small, consistent acts of self-respect. On boundaries maintained, on worth acknowledged, on truth honored. If you're standing at your own kitchen counter, facing your own moment of decision, remember this. You aren't alone. The key to your freedom, to your authentic self, has been in your hands all along. Your home, your heart, your life. These aren't temporary loans granted by someone else's approval. They are permanent gifts that belong solely to you. You were never meant to be someone's temporary anything. You are and have always been the permanent author of your own story.